wasn't until more recently that I heard about effective altruism. This movement was there that gave this very rational approach to that very emotional want to make it. When you're talking about donations, it really appears to that sense of knowing exactly where that $100 is going to go and how it's going to be used. It's transparent, it's clear, it's clean, it's effectiveness. To me, it's completely counter to that kind of confusion that's around at the moment. So I think it's really important, really valid now. My name is Andy. I recommend you.
Hey, my name's not Andy. Hi, I'm Catherine. I'm here today because we have got an amazing organisation called Effective Altruism. I'm fairly new to Effective Altruism, as may many of you in the room here be, so you don't need to be someone who's been a proponent of it for many years to know what's going on. I discovered it about in May last year when I went to the Centre for Applied Rationality over in San Francisco and did their program. While we're here, I'd like to pay our respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and honour our elders, past and present, as well as our elders in the room here tonight as well. And as soon as my slides are up, that's okay. Okay, well, slides are not working, but that's okay. So one of the first things I'm going to get you to do is I actually would like you to stand up. And I'd like you to find someone that you haven't met, someone you don't know. Find yourself your buddy, and I want you to find one buddy, partner there with you, and I want you to look into their eyes. Okay? And then I want you to look your buddy up and down, because the first thing you do when you meet someone, what is it? You judge your buddy, don't you? You find your buddy, and the first thing you do is you judge your buddy. So judge your buddy. I want you to look them up and down. Look at their clothes, the way they're talking. Judge them really, really bad. And now in complete silence, I want you to look at your buddy in their left eye. And when you look at your buddy in their left eye, I want you to get a number in your mind. And that number is your buddy's income. Now imagine that number. Get that number in your mind. Is it higher or lower than yours? Have a think about this. Feel the discomfort. Just keep that number in your mind. Okay, and on the count of 5, I want you to tell your buddy that number. You ready? 1, 2, 3. Whoa. It's okay. I'm not going to let you say it. But did anyone, when they thought they were going to have to tell their buddy, did anyone change that number in their mind? Did they have a quick change? Shame on your buddy. Shame on them. Now, in that moment, when you thought that you were going to have to tell them, you made a decision and you had to murder all the alternatives because you have to pull out one number. And that decision determined your priorities. Were you going to tell the truth in that moment, or were you going to let something else influence what you were going to say? Okay, come to your original number in your mind that you have for your buddy. Now, if you had the lower number, or if your buddy had the lower number, I want you to imagine that number, and I want you to double it. I want you to raise it up. So look at your buddy, imagine that number, and I want you to double it up. And then double it again. So the person with the lower number that you imagined, I want you to double it and double it again until they have the higher number in your mind. And the person that you thought had the higher number, I want you to halve that number. If you thought the person who had the higher number in your mind and between the two of you, I want you to halve it and then halve it again. So in your mind, your original number that you had for yourself and your buddy, the person that you thought had the lower number, you doubled it and doubled it again until they had the highest number. And the person you thought had the highest number, you halved it and halved it again until they had the lowest number. Now I want you to make it real. Why did those numbers change? What's the story? If that number was real, what happened in that person's life to give them the high number or the low number? I want you to have a think about that for a second. Just have a think about what the assumptions are. That person's number was halved and halved again. The assumptions that you have about why that number is the number that it is. Was it competence or was it chance? Judging you. You give buddy a big thank you, and I want you to find another new person to go and talk to, someone else you don't know. Find a new buddy. Someone new, someone else that you haven't met yet. We had to find someone new. Cool, are you happy? I didn't really bother. Now with your new buddy. Ben already does know. Now with your new buddy, I want you to have a think about all the models that you know. Now I know we're a very, very intelligent room here, and you know a lot of models of frameworks of thinking and philosophies and psychologies, and have a think about how what you just learnt might relate to effective altruism. And I want you to teach your buddy what you just learnt from that exercise about your judgments, your assumptions, how you felt, and how that might be perceived to other people. And if you want to share the numbers with them, because this person doesn't know what number you came up with before, that's okay too. So tell your new buddy. pretty smart buddy. Yeah? You know, a few smart buddies in the room who knew a few things about different models of the universe and the ways of their thinking. So, something for those of you staying today and those who are staying for the entire weekend for the conference. There's a sweet spot with every piece of information that you learn. And someone may give a piece of advice, and it's for a certain type of person. And you want to know whether that piece of information is for the type of person that you are. And so that takes a bit of self-reflection and understanding of who you are, because every piece of information is going to be wrong. And so understanding whether that piece is the right piece for you is going to be crucial to taking the right actions. So thank you for playing. And I'd now like to introduce Ben Todd. Ben is co-founder and CEO of 80,000 Hours, which provides career advice to high-achieving individuals on how to have as much social impact as possible. They're a key part of the effective altruism movement and have significantly changed the career plans of hundreds of people. 80,000 Hours was also one of the first non-profits to go through one of the most well-known and powerful startup incubators, Y Combinator. He has published in climate physics, once kickboxed for Oxford, and speaks Chinese pretty badly. He's also just lost his passport, unfortunately. So please give a warm welcome to the stage, Ben Todd.
Hi everyone, yeah, I just found out about that on the way to the event, so I'm not in the best frame of mind for giving a talk, but the show will go on. So I'm going to talk about why we need effective altruism and give a kind of overview of the whole thing. The world has become a weird place. Instead of spending money on a fancy holiday, I could just about spend that money and use it to save a child's life by donating to Against Malaria Foundation. So Peter Singer argued that we should forego almost all spending on luxuries in order to do this. And this conference is about effective altruism, and this is what many people think effective altruism is. It's just about donating money to Against Malaria Foundation and other charities that are similar to it. But at the risk of pushing back against Singer on his home ground of Australia, I'm going to argue that effective altruism is much broader than that. It's about finding high-impact actions with relatively little sacrifice to yourself, whatever those are, whatever those turn out to be, where donating to Against Malaria Foundation is just one example. But here's some other examples that have been analysed by the community. So we did an analysis of the effectiveness of voting, and we actually argued that by making sure you, in a close election, by making sure your vote goes to the right candidate, it might plausibly have social impact of social value to the country of tens of thousands of dollars, which isn't bad for an hour spent voting. Or as another example, just by giving up factory farm chicken to making no other change to your diet would be enough to save hundreds of animals over your lifetime from lives near torture and factory farms. And with issues like climate change, nuclear war, genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, our decisions have the potential to affect the very future of civilization. And this means the actions of the present generation could either have a very positive or a very negative impact on the long run. This situation has just come about since around the 1950s due to technological and economic progress. All this progress has created both new, bigger problems to address, and also it's given us the means to deal with them. And the combination of the two means that our individual actions are far more consequential than they've ever been before. It's no surprise, given how fast these changes have happened, that ethics hasn't caught up. Common sense ethics is mostly about not doing harm. So, in fact, even most very modern ethics focuses a lot on human rights. And the idea there is that as long as you don't violate other people's rights, then you can do what you want, and then that's having a good life. And of course, it's true, absolutely, that we should uphold human rights. But the issue is that when we also have so much power to do good, human rights are only half of the equation. Instead, I think we need a new guide to a good life, one that focuses much more on our potential to do good in the world, rather than just not doing harm. And so I think effective altruism has the potential to be that guide. And what is effective altruism? So my definition is it's the search for high-impact actions using evidence and reason. And it's an intellectual movement that tries to do this. Just as the scientific revolution was the search for truth using evidence and reason, effective altruism is the search for actions that do good using evidence and reason. So yeah, I'm Ben, the CEO and co-founder of 80,000 Hours, which helped to start the effective altruism movement in Oxford in 2012. And in this talk, I'm going to explain a bit more depth why I think effective altruism is important and what has changed to make it so just in the last few decades. So I've been talking about effective altruism and saying that it's about finding actions that help others. Other people will talk about making a social impact, doing good, making a difference. Firstly, what do all these phrases mean? At 80,000 Hours, our answer is that an action helps others to the extent that it improves people's lives, improves people's welfare. And by that I mean it allows them to live happier, healthier, more meaningful lives in the long run. And so from that definition, then there's three ways you can have a greater social impact, or you can do more to help others. You can either help a larger number of people, you can help the same number of people to a greater extent, or you can do actions that have a greater long-run impact, which you can think of as extending this into the back of the projector and then making a 3D cube, which is a social impact. So people disagree about how exactly we should understand welfare. Is it about satisfying preferences, positive emotions, capabilities? But I'm going to claim that I don't think these differences actually matter that much for my argument. And so here is the argument. I'm going to argue that everyone should be able to agree that it's good to help others, understood roughly in that way. Secondly, as of the last few decades especially, different actions have come to vary a huge amount in how much they help others. 1 and 2 together mean that we should really try hard to find these high-impact actions. And then thirdly, I'm going to argue that we then need the scientific method, evidence and reason, to find these actions. Just going with our intuition isn't enough. And then putting all three together is the case for why we need effective altruism, the search for high-impact actions using evidence and reason, using the scientific method. Okay, so firstly, modern moral philosophy talks about 3 main types of ethical theory. The first of these, utilitarianism, says that helping others is all that matters. The best action to take is the one that does the most to help other people. And that sounds kind of narrow. One question is then often is, do utilitarians care about the environment, justice, human rights, caring for your family? And the simple answer to that is yes. A world in which we let the environment degrade, there's no human rights, people don't care for their families, is one in which we all have less welfare in the long run. So utilitarians care about those things insofar as they let people have better lives. And the difference is that they do it for that instrumental reason, rather than as an end in itself. So now turning to the other ones, the difference is that while utilitarians think that only helping other people matters, the other 2 types of ethics think that other things matter as well. But they still agree that it's good to help people. So deontologists think that there's certain rules that we shouldn't break, such as human rights, even if breaking them would lead to more people having better lives in the long run. But they still agree that it's good to help people whenever you're not violating those rights. All else equal, if you could either help 2 people or help 1 person, they'd agree that it's morally preferable to help 2 people. And this is just a point of agreement that's kind of so obvious that it never comes up when people are debating ethics. It's overlooked. The third type of ethics, virtue ethics, says that having a good life is about having good character. But virtue ethicists also talk about the virtue of benevolence or compassion, which basically mean helping others. It's hard to imagine how you could have a virtuous life while you also forego easy opportunities to help other people a great deal with little cost to yourself. So John Rawls, one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century, who wasn't a utilitarian, said all ethical doctrines worth our attention take consequences into account in judging rightness. By consequences, he means whether you're helping people or not. One which did not would simply be irrational or crazy. So basically, I think every major type of ethical theory can agree that it's good to help people if you can do so without making a major sacrifice. The main difference comes down to how much emphasis to put on helping. Okay, so second thing is, in the world today, some actions do far more to help than others. I gave a couple of examples in the introduction: your choice of which charity to donate to, your choice of what to eat, choosing where to vote. All of these things, sometimes some options seem much higher impact than others. Another way of looking at this is if you look in history, you can find some examples of people who've had way more impact than most of us. So for instance, Norman Borlaug discovered dwarf wheat, which then helped to kickstart the Green Revolution. And some have estimated that this discovery might have saved as many as 1 billion lives. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for reducing the chance of conflict between India and Pakistan. So why do some people have so much more impact than others? Why is there such a large spread in the effects of different actions? Here's one way to see how that comes about. So let's consider just this question of which career to take, which is the question that we analyze at 80,000 hours. We often then break the impact of a career down into 3 components. The first one is, how pressing is the problem that you're addressing? The second thing is, how effective is the method you're using to address that problem? And then thirdly, there's, do you have good personal fit with that career path? Now, we argue that all 3 of these things can vary a great deal. So for instance, we've argued that some problems are over 100 times more pressing to address than others. When it comes to the methods or interventions, some interventions have no effect, some cause harm, and some are enormously effective. So there's a lot of variation there. And then also, if you look at the research on performance, often the best performers in a field have output that's 10 or even 100 times the worst people in the field. So if you think each of these 3 things could vary by a factor of 10, when you then multiply all 3 of them together, you get to a total variation of a factor of 1,000, which is a huge difference, if you're assuming that they're roughly uncorrelated. So I think also much the same could be said for the choice of which charity to donate to. You could run a very similar analysis and get really big differences in impact. But these kinds of differences are not widely appreciated. So for instance, we surveyed people in America and we asked them how much they think different charities vary in effectiveness. And people thought that the best charities were about 66% better than the worst charities within an area. But we think that the difference is at least tenfold, even if you consider relatively narrow areas, such as health in the developing world. So, kind of common sense has not caught up with these large differences. People think that the differences between charities are small, but they're actually much bigger than people think. What has changed to drive these big differences? I think the key factor is basically increasing technological power, wealth, globalization. A few hundred years ago, basically everyone was poor, and the effects of our actions were just limited to those immediately around us. And at that point, an ethics focused on not doing harm was basically up to the job. But then this happened. And so from the 18th century in Britain, the Industrial Revolution got started. And this is a graph of world average income, showing that from that point, it's just completely exploded and not looked back. This is the same if you look at lots of other measures of progress. So for instance, the percentage of people living in a democracy also skyrocketing, life expectancy has skyrocketed. The number of people living in extreme poverty is dramatically falling. And this process has continued to today, just giving individuals greater and greater power. Just as of the last few decades, it's now the case that with just a click of a button, you can send a life-changing amount of money to someone in Africa, or you can burn a load of carbon dioxide, which will be around for 1,000 years, or you can cause a bunch of animals to be raised in a factory farm. Whereas even in the 1960s, we didn't really have non-religious international aid, or factory farming, or a scientific consensus on climate change. Even since just the 90s, it's become the case that if you have a new idea, it can now spread across the whole world pretty much instantly if you get into the front page of Reddit. And then that, again, just was not possible just a few decades ago. And most extremely, in the 1950s, we built a lot of nuclear weapons, and that meant it became possible for just a very small number of people to wreak havoc and even potentially to end civilization. a thing that had never been possible to do before. And there's lots of other risky technologies around today, which I'm going to talk about in my talk tomorrow. And all of these things mean that individual decisions are just way more consequential than they've ever been before. I also think these kind of big variations in impact are what we should expect just theoretically thinking about it. So the world economy you can think of as a really complex, chaotic system with lots of inputs, feedback loops, and these kinds of systems often just produce really big differences in outcomes. As another example, this is a graph of bankruptcies in America during the 2000s, and you can see that the biggest bankruptcy, which was Lehman Brothers, was basically as big as all the others put together. And this kind of pattern, where extreme events dominate, was popularized by Nassim Taleb in the book Black Swan. And I think we should expect it to be the same for doing good. Some actions will produce extreme impact compared to the typical actions. Third reason, another way of seeing it, is that I think big variations in impact exist because few people have tried to be really systematic about doing good in the past. And there's little external incentive to focus on the best ways of helping. So in contrast, when it comes to the world of business, if you do something stupid over and over again, then you're going to lose all your money. But there's no equivalent efficient market for doing good. There's no external incentive pushing people to focus on the actions that most help people. In fact, it was only in the 1990s that people seriously started to test NGO or government programs to see if they really worked. And in fact, even today, only about 1% of NGO programs are ever tested with a randomized control trial. This inefficiency, however, means that for people who do take a systematic approach for doing good, then there's lots of really powerful ways to have an impact that just are lying around and untaken. Okay, so what's the result of everything we've covered so far? Since actions vary so much in their impact, we should expect in many decisions there will be a subset of our actions that will have far more impact than the others, even if they involve the same amount of personal sacrifice. And since we all agree that it's good to help others, clearly it's really important to try and find these high-impact actions and take them. So here's a kind of stylized example. Imagine you can choose between 3 careers. First one helps 3 people, harms 1 person. Second one helps 1 person, harms no one. Third one helps 100 people and harms no one. So a lot of normal ethical debates are about whether to take 1 or 2, which one is permissible or better. But clearly that's besides the point. You should just take 3 and get on with it. And so the idea of effective altruism is that we're kind of always in situations like this, where there's just one really high-impact thing, and that's what we should focus on. And that's why we think we need an intellectual project to try and find these high-impact actions. So the third thing is then, why do we need to use evidence and reason to find these high-impact actions? Doing good is normally based on common sense or going with our intuition or helping people immediately around you. So there's like charity begins at home. But as we've seen, doing good in the modern world is not intuitive. The effects of our actions are not just confined to those immediately around us. They spread around the globe and long into the future. And common sense has not caught up with this changed situation. In fact, as was discovered in the 1970s, our thinking is subject to cognitive biases, which mean that our thinking goes systematically wrong, and which sheds doubt on our ability just to simply trust our intuition. In fact, today, researchers basically agree that intuition works really well in situations where the environment is stable, you've got clear feedback on how well you're doing, and you have an opportunity to practice. So a chess grandmaster has really good intuition about the best move in chess. But the world of doing good is not like this in any of these ways. The world is always changing. We often don't see the effects of our actions, and we only get one chance to make our major life decisions. We don't get to try over and over again. So I think we can't just rely with our intuition, following our heart, common sense when it comes to doing good. Instead, we need the scientific method. We've known this is the best way for finding truth since the 16th century and the scientific revolution, but in many areas we've still not really properly applied it. Okay, and so putting all these 3 things together, we need the scientific method to search for the highest impact ways of doing good, which is effective altruism. Now I just want to point out a couple of misconceptions. So firstly, effective altruism is not about global poverty. So some high impact actions involve helping those in poverty, but I've also mentioned examples concerning factory farming, nuclear policy, climate change, and so on. In fact, I'm going to argue tomorrow that I think more effects altruists should focus on issues which aren't global poverty. Secondly, it's not about donating money to charity. Again, donating money to charity is just one high-impact way that you can help. But personally, I think that questions about which career to pursue are usually much more important than questions about donations. And I also think that changing government policy is hugely important, and again, often much more important than charitable donations. Thirdly, it's not about randomized control trials. So this is when you want to test an intervention and you choose a group of people and you randomly select half to get the intervention and half don't get it, and then you compare the difference of the two groups later on. It's a way of testing whether what you're doing works. And many people think, effects altruists think that you should only support charities that have randomized control trials backing what they do. But I've argued that effects altruism is about applying the scientific method, and the scientific method is not just randomized control trials. We've made intellectual advances like understanding evolution, the Big Bang, computer science, and none of those involve doing randomized control trials, but they're still scientific. So while randomized control trials are great, and I would love to see a lot more of them done, many people in the community work on projects that aren't backed by randomized control trials. Okay, and the fourth thing is, often people object to effects altruism by just making standard objections to utilitarianism. So they just say, well, I care about my family more than strangers, so I shouldn't do effects altruism. But effects altruism is much broader than utilitarianism. There's lots of people who aren't utilitarians in the community. The difference is that utilitarianism says that human welfare is all that matters, and you should treat strangers completely equally to yourself and your family, and you should do as much as possible to increase welfare, no matter the personal costs. Whereas effects altruism just says helping people is one important goal, among others you might have, and that it's good to help people so long as you don't have to make a major sacrifice. And as I've argued, I think this is something that everyone should be able to agree with, whether you're a utilitarian or not. In fact, many critiques of effects altruism, like those that appeared in the Boston Review after Peter Singer's book was released, managed to combine all four of these into one, and they argue against the idea that you should donate as much money as possible to charities that are backed by randomized control trials that help those in global poverty. And then they're like, well, clearly this is a bad idea. And like, yes, that's missing the point. Effects altruism is about finding the best ways to help, no matter what they are. Okay, and then finally people often ask, well, you know, this stuff sounds pretty obvious. Is effects altruism obvious? Why didn't it come about earlier? And yeah, I agree, effects altruism is obvious in a way. It's good to help people, and if you're going to help people, it's good to do it effectively rather than ineffectively. But there's a difference between it being obvious and whether it's important or not. And I think, although obvious, it's only become important in recent decades. So if you're a middle-class Victorian, there wasn't that much you could do beyond looking after yourself and your family. But that really began to change from especially the 1950s onwards. So here's some of the key developments I've mentioned in the talk so far. As you can see, many of the key issues that effects altruists focus on only really got going from the 1950s. And it was only in the 1990s that people started to take an evidence-based or scientific approach to dealing with some of these issues. I don't know why nothing happened in the 80s. Clearly that was not a good decade for altruism. It was only then in the 2000s that some of the key precursor groups got started, like GiveWell. And then the other key development was the invention of the internet, scale-up. And that enabled us to then bring some of these strands together. In the late 2000s, we realized that there were pockets of people all around the world who kind of were interested in these ideas. And although we were working on lots of different issues, there was a commonality in that we really wanted to find the most effective ways to help, and we wanted to be serious about putting them into practice. So in Oxford, we started calling these people super hardcore do-gooders, but we soon realized that we needed a better name than that. So just in 2012, a couple of years later, we founded the Centre for Effective Altruism in Oxford. And that was initially an umbrella organisation for our activities in Oxford, but the name stuck for the movement in general. And yeah, I still remember us on the email thread for deciding the name, and we were all kind of annoyed at how long the discussion was dragging on for. We considered every permutation you could imagine, rational do-gooding and like strategic, helping people. We almost settled on strategic altruism for a while, but then we kind of polled some people and we realized that sounds like doing good in order to like benefit yourself. So we ended up on effective altruism. So looking at all this, I think actually effective altruism arose almost as soon as it could. We needed all these developments fed into it, and it only then took a few years later before we kind of spotted the common thread. In fact, I think just since then, effective altruism has progressed a lot faster than we expected. So today there's billions of dollars backing this approach. This is the money pledged by members of Giving What We Can, which is our sister charity. And in fact, just in 2017, which isn't on this graph, the amount pledged surpassed $1 billion. And then that again is eclipsed by the Open Philanthropy Project, which is a foundation with money from one of the founders of Facebook that takes an effective altruism approach to where it decides to give. And it is expected to give over perhaps about $10 billion over the next 2 decades. Awareness of the ideas is also growing rapidly. It's just tripled in the last year or two. And also thousands of people have really made huge changes to their career decisions. So the other point about effective altruism being obvious is that there's a difference between the premises being obvious and then the conclusions that applying those ideas leads you to. So it's similar to how the scientific method is kind of obvious, like test your assumptions. Sounds really obvious, right? But if you keep applying that, you end up with quantum mechanics. And yeah, I would have never guessed that giving careers advice would be what I'd end up doing, but that's now what I spend all my time doing. And, you know, I started out focused on climate change, and I never would have guessed that I'd be working on issues to do with artificial intelligence, like I am now. So, as I hope we'll see over the rest of the conference, figuring out the best ways to help others is a huge intellectual challenge. We need to address all of these kinds of questions that are listed here. And although there's already a lot of relevant knowledge to draw on to answer all of these questions, there's also a lot of things within that have never really been rigorously addressed before. There's a lot of intellectual ground. So now we all have so much power to do good and to make the world a better place. Our common sense view of what it means to live a good life needs to be rethought. In this conference, I hope you'll join in with this project to find the best ways of doing good, and I hope you'll find better, higher impact ways to contribute with your own life. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Awesome, this is working. Do you want to grab a seat over at the table over here?
Yeah.
Since you've already been introduced. We'll bring all our lovely panelists up. I'd like to play musical chairs and pick a seat. I'll introduce Bridget first. This is Dr. Bridget Williams here. She is the manager of Effective Altruism Australia. Bridget's also a medical doctor, and she's undertaking advanced training in public health medicine. She has a large passion for healthcare, and she apparently just came over and discovered it and thought it was a really good idea. So you don't need to have a big fancy story behind why you do things other than to think it's a good idea. So, I mean, Ben just mentioned then that communicating and coordinating as a community is essential to having these changes and shifts take place. How do you see effective altruism and yourself as being instrumental in making that happen?
Yeah, very good question. I think that, so I guess just to introduce Effective Altruism Australia as well. So Effective Altruism Australia is actually a charitable organisation that uses the ideas of effective altruism, but as applied to alleviation of poverty through private donations, which, as we've just heard, is not the only thing that effective altruism is concerned with, but it's what our organisation is focused on. So I guess one of the things that I think is really important, and one of the things that I'll hope that our panel will be able to help with tonight, is the fact that, I think effective altruism needs a lot of voices and needs a lot of people. And there's a lot of different ways to be able to do good in the world. And that I think that by collaborating and coordinating with people, then we can have a much bigger impact.
Fantastic, thank you. And next in line here we have Dr. Stewart Condon. We have our medical people in the middle here, just in case anyone has anything happening. They'll be running up to save you. It's okay. He's a medical doctor with extensive experience working in Australia and around the world. After completing his degree and junior years in Sydney, he worked in remote Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory as a rural medical practitioner. He's worked around the world, and he now is with Médecins Sans Frontières, otherwise known as Doctors Without Borders. And so, Stewart, as far as working with a program is concerned, we see a lot of individuals versus and sort of large organisations. How do you see the conflict of interest between the long-term and the short-term goals in making sure something is sustainable as a program?
It's a good question. Look, MSF has got a long history of emergency response. I think you know the organisation. We've been around for more than 40 years. We have been accused of being the Band-Aid in the past. But having said that, we were the only actor in Biafra in the 70s. We were the major actor in Ebola in the last few years, and we were effectively the only healthcare provider in 3 countries in West Africa, saving lives there. So I do appreciate the points that we've got to think about the effectivity, the efficiency of what we do. But there's an imperative, I would argue, and I think this comes to a couple of points Ben's made, about just making the decision to be there. And I think that probably comes to what your career advice relates to a lot of people these days. We need to look at programs according to needs. That's what we do. In terms of sustainability, we're always going to have a bigger view. For MSF, we try to look at the immediate needs and what we can do. We also look at what we can't do, and I think this is common amongst NGOs in the world today. We're quite realistic about what we can't do just as much as what we can. We don't want to come back to our donors and say we've spent X million dollars or euros of their funds and not being able to achieve any objectives. So for us, sustainability is important. We look at the short term immediately in MSF, but we also look at the longer term. But our longer term is looking in a very broad context. We try to look at the other actors, the Ministry of Health in a particular country for medical needs.
Fantastic. And next up we have Dr. Helen Szoke. She's a Chief Executive of Oxfam Australia. She's a focus on foreign aid, human rights, gender and race discrimination. She has an astonishing history of working with many prestigious organisations, earnestly furthering their causes. And in last year, was a finalist in the Telstra Businesswoman of the Year. So, I could name, there's a whole long list of organisations that you've worked with. No, I'm not going to, it's okay. So, through working with all of these vast organisations, how have you found sort of the risk profile when you're a large size here? As you just mentioned about the donors and making sure you're coming back to say that you've achieved the goal. Would you agree, or would you have a comment on that maybe smaller charities would have a greater risk profile that you would partner with and then sort of work with them that way, or is there a larger picture here at play which is lower risk?
Well, I think, I don't think I know, it's fair to say that for the international NGOs like MSF and Oxfam and others, that there is a different focus that we've all taken. So in the case of Oxfam, we have grown quite unashamedly adopting a human rights-based approach. So we certainly have a role to play in a humanitarian response, and in our case that's normally water and sanitation, because that's where we build our expertise, so we get a concentration of expertise. We're certainly involved in long-term development, and we work with partners, so we don't do any direct service provision. We believe that we need to work alongside people rather than doing things for them. But I think the other thing that we think is pretty critical, and this is where it gets challenging to talk to donors about this, is if you're going to get fundamental change, you have to pull big levers. And that means there has to be an influencing and an advocacy agenda. So Oxfam has chosen a number of issues that it thinks it can work with our partners in countries and to work to try to influence governments across the world, because they will, to take the point there, make big change. So certainly activism around climate change is one of those. One of the biggest barriers to lifting people out of poverty is the impact of climate change. We've done a lot of work on the widening gap between the rich and the poor, because not only does that entrench poverty with minorities and vulnerable communities, but it also concentrates power in the hands of the very wealthy. And so we try to operate in the forums of to influence how that might change. What's the responsibility of government? What's the responsibility of the private sector to make those changes? And we've also had a critical voice, I think, around rights in crisis, which seems to be even more critical when we just think about what's happened even in the last week or so. If we think about where is the diplomacy or civil society voice that's needed to try to get some sense around what's happening in Myanmar with the Rohingya refugees. Where is the influence of civil society and the voice of civil society when the UN Security Council meets and is looking at the interests of the world? So, I think that's where we see that we add our expertise. We can do that because we're a big machine. That has its whole other problems, but we've grown from grassroots movements and tried to hang on to that integrity, and in fact are trying to reform so that we're much more southern facing now, but fundamentally believe that to get the kind of change where people can have control of their lives, you need to focus on big levers as well as small levers and work with people being empowered in the communities that they're working in. And, I can perhaps talk more about examples of it.
Absolutely, that would be great to hear more about it later. First of all, though, we have to introduce Julian Burnside on the end here. Julian is a barrister in commercial litigation, trade practices and administrative law. He's also a human rights and refugee advocate and author. His latest book, Watching Out, Concerning the Justice System, was released last month. Now, Julian, you've been quite vocal about how refugees have been mischaracterised as illegals and the different assumptions we make about plane people and boat people and differences along those lines there. What would you say is the best, worst advice out there? Things that sound good but that really aren't good, the advice that's going out to people today?
I'm not sure what this has to do with altruism, but the worst thing is that the government lies about asylum seekers. And our views, when this does intersect with altruism actually, our views are shaped by what we believe. And if you believe that boat people are criminals from whom we need to be protected, you'll respond one way. If you understand that they're just human beings escaping desperate circumstances, you'll respond a different way. I had a very interesting introduction to this idea. I'm involved with some people helping them make a film about refugees. They've been carting me around the world, and as someone unkindly pointed out, I've been given the role as David Attenborough. And in January they took me to Scotland, and in Scotland, with a population about the same as Sydney, as at January this year when I was there, Scotland had settled more than 1,000 Syrian refugees in the community. They've done better than Australia had done it in the same time. And in my conversations with various people at various levels of politics, I said, well, we're doing what we do and you're doing this. How do you account for the difference? And they all said, these are human beings, they need our help. I can't think of any Australian parliamentarian who would speak like that. And that the fact that you see people as other human beings is a really powerful starting point for the instinct to do something which may cost you a little or may cost you a lot, and which will achieve something more or less great for that other person. And that's perhaps at the foundation of... I mean, I probably don't entirely share Ben's views about what altruism is and what its origins are, but I think you have to start with the proposition that other people are human beings, and then you ask, well, what can I do, what should I do that might help them?
Absolutely. Now, Ben, you mentioned just in your presentation here about the name of effective altruism instead of strategic altruism. But isn't it true that a lot of people are altruistic for their own ends? How would you approach this in order, I mean, wouldn't it be good to have people helping regardless of their motivations?
Does this still work?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I actually almost put that point in the talk, but I ran out of time. So we argue in the first article of the 80K Career Guide that if you want a personally fulfilling and satisfying career, then you should do something that helps other people. And so there's personal reasons to want to help others as well. And that's, yeah, another reason why we can all agree that it's good to focus on helping others.
Okay, that was a quick one. I'll jump straight to you for another one. What do you see as EA's blind spots? I mean, it's opened us up to everyone now. What do you see as the blind spots of effective altruism as a philosophy or a concept? Don't be shy, it's okay.
Not because I'm just being anti. I'm fascinated in the idea, and Ben's presentation tonight actually articulated a lot of the misconceptions, which I completely appreciate. But there's definitions which I think are easy to assume, and there are assumptions which are made. So, doing good. Well, what is good? What do I define as good as a white Australian man in my mid-40s versus doing good as an African leader in charge of a country who has a mass epidemic health emergency? Is good for one of our parliamentarians protecting their population and being able to get into the next election, or their votes, or is good having a bit more of a broader sense of helping people? And that's one of, I think, one of the most interesting, and obviously I haven't had the depth of the conversations and understanding of the movement as much as many in the room, but I think that's one of the interesting parts of what we're all trying to maybe get to. What is good and who is the good for? Because in MSF we think of good in terms of the beneficiary, the patient, the person at the end of the bed who's getting a treatment, whether that's a mental health treatment from a psychiatrist or a mental health worker or an antibiotic or an anti-malarial. So we see it in easy, concrete terms. Whereas I think for effective altruism, it seems like it's a bit more loose. So I think it's not necessarily a blind spot, but I think it's one of the areas where a definition around what is good and who is the good for would be very helpful, so that I think the message could be articulated even better.
Can I take that one step further? And this is particularly aimed at the medical profession. Everyone is familiar with the conundrum. You're standing on a bridge near a railway line. There is a train coming down the track, and if you do nothing, it is going to plough through 5 people who are standing on the track. But if you pull the lever, it will be diverted onto a side track where there is one person. That one person will be killed. Most people would think, well, probably better pull the lever so that only one person dies instead of 5. Now, you're a doctor in a hospital, and a healthy young patient comes in, and you've got 5 patients who need a lung, a liver, a kidney, a heart, and you can kill that one person and save all 5. What will you do? What is good to do in that case?
I'll follow Ben's example and give... I'll follow Ben's example and give a short answer. Obviously, do no harm is one of our ethics, and I wouldn't find it very easy to kill that person. Is this live streaming, by the way?
Yes, it is.
So I could not kill that person.
What about the one on the train track?
You're medical too.
Yeah, I mean, I think this makes a really good point about some of the narrow interpretations of utilitarianism, because I think a lot of people or consequentialism in general, I think a lot of people who might identify as consequentialists would still think that you shouldn't kill the patient and steal their 5 organs because of the social value of having that norm where that's not a done thing. That, you know, you can trust your doctor and you can trust a hospital that when you're under the anaesthetic that they're not going to harvest your organs for other people.
And the five humanitarian sponsors who need medical treatment, you wouldn't kill the convicted criminal who's come in but he's healthy.
I mean, this is...
I agree with it, but how do you distinguish that case from the train line?
I mean, this is a good example of what I was trying to talk about in the talk, which is that these kinds of situations are very fun to debate, but ultimately aren't very relevant for real decisions because there's much bigger differences in the impact of different actions, and those things tend to outweigh these. These are borderline cases because they're chosen because they're the interesting ones to debate, but they're not. Often we don't have a borderline case. We have much more clear-cut cases where neither action violates human rights and one helps more people, so let's do that one. And
my point in raising it, though, is to investigate the question of what constitutes good. And, of course, if you're the patient, you may not think it's so good. If you're the one guy on the train line, you may not think it's good.
So, do you want to...
So I guess I want to, I mean, I think those dilemmas are important ones to flesh out, but maybe I'm supporting what you're saying, I'm not quite sure. I think that the decision about what contribution you make is much more complex than that. And I think that for some of us, we got lucky and we, you know, I think about myself, you know, so we end up being in roles where you feel as though you're making an important contribution. But the kind of, I guess, you know, that's the attraction of the way that Oxfam works for me, is that there is enormous complexity. So if you think about the kind of challenges that exist in the world at the moment, and I know you're not suggesting it, but they're not kind of binary challenges. They're challenges where there is enormous interrelatedness. So I would think that MSF were in Sierra Leone dealing with the Ebola crisis and absolutely putting their own lives at risk to operate in an absolutely untenable situation. Other organisations, and I think Oxfam may have been there, may not have been, but the focus that we will take is to say the reason the Ebola crisis occurred is because the government of Sierra Leone chooses to pay massive subsidies to attract multinational companies in extractive industries rather than investing in public health. So I think I'm right in saying that Ebola occurs very regularly on the African continent, and countries like Kenya and others that have got a much better health system manage it, and it gets under control and it doesn't become a plague. And so when we talk about what contribution you want to make, or what charity you want to support, or how you want to live your life, I think there's just a wealth of opportunities to kind of perhaps look at the complexity and say what works in terms of the best match for me and my set of beliefs in doing what has to be done, because God knows there's a hell of a lot that has to be done. So you can choose to help with that immediate response of saving lives. You can choose to support another organisation that has a slower burn to trying to deal with these issues. And I don't think it's binary. I think they're both legitimate. And what we see is that the skill set, the history, the evidence base of these sort of organisations have a theory of change. And what's important is that we're transparent about that. So you can see that if you support MSF, you're completely clear they're going to be fearless in the front of major humanitarian responses. If you support Oxfam, you know that you're not going to get the same clear-cut number of beneficiaries. What you're going to get is the investment in a different kind of change process that we hope will try to change some of the fundamentals so MSF doesn't have to go in and save lives, if that makes sense. That's a bit too simplistic, but that's what I think would be not so much a blind spot of effective altruism, but it's not a binary world we're in, and good is complex, as you know.
Good definitely is complex. I mean, these situations are often about our conscious choices and us choosing to step forward. But I mean, Ben was saying about how those sort of dilemmas are not really relevant to us in our everyday lives, and these things that we're creating out to be big steps or donating money or career-changing decisions, what about taking it back and scaling it to our everyday lives? I mean, Julian, in your defence of refugees, you've received pretty intense hate mail, some of which is published in your recent book. And Helen, you've chaired and advised for several organisations on bullying and harassment. Having strong principles in this area can often make you a person who is likely to be criticised and put into the way of. And there are people out there who, when they see something going on right in front of them, they just say they don't want to get involved, or they don't believe they have a moral responsibility to even out this inequality. What would you say to these type of people that see it going on right underneath their noses?
You have to do what you think is right. And the trouble is that, I mean, I have the advantage of being the oldest person on the panel. And if half of Australia hates me, well, too bad for them. It doesn't matter. If I was in my mid-20s and at the start of my career, then having a lot of people hating me might have consequences for my family. And then I'd have to toss up which is right and which is good. Not easy. Of course, if you do it professionally, as Helen does, then that's maybe different. But imagine if you got involved in a deeply unpopular cause that you happen to believe in, and that was going to cut off your career development. It might be more difficult, especially if the career development held in prospect something like Oxfam, where you could do a great deal of good. So what do you do?
Take the microphone from you. I agree. For people, I mean, we might be good people, but we're pretty privileged. Julian's a lawyer, so he's a bit more privileged than I am. I've only had salaried jobs. But, you're quite right. It's a very different position. But I do think you have to cut the cloth to fit who you are as a person. You have to be true to yourself. And there are times where, even in my, public roles where, if you're dealing with racism, you can get some pretty bizarre reactions, and where you do feel, I've got grown-up kids now, but they were little once, and there's a lot of them between us, there's 8. We've now got grandchildren. You're protective about, your own family as well. But I think, so cut the cloth to suit, I guess would be my response. But at the end of the day, think about the people that we see, the images that we see. Think about the lives of the people that are irreparably interrupted by conflict or by economic circumstances or by climatic events. We're about to launch quite a significant campaign focusing on garment workers. Think about what it's like to live in a tin shed with masses of other people and not earn a living wage, and to be trapped in a cycle of poverty. And I think that people like you and people like my kids and, their friends, that's what they think about. And then I think that's what emboldens them to determine what their contribution can be. Whether that's donating money, whether it's volunteering, whether it's starting up a charity of their own.
It's a good point to make a choice based upon cutting that cloth for yourself. Ben, in your advice and career coaching these people, what are the challenges that you're seeing people facing in making these decisions?
Yeah, also just to agree with your point, I think this is a blind spot for effective altruism in a way, some of the issues around this. And I recently gave a talk about this at Effective Altruism Global Boston, and it was also the theme of Effective Altruism San Francisco, which is how do we best have an impact together as a community? And so I think often when you first hear about effective altruism, you end up with what's called a single player perspective. So you imagine that what everyone else does is fixed, and you're just a single actor at the margin, and then you try and find the highest impact thing at the margin that you could do. But now we're in a situation where there's actually thousands of people in the effective altruism community, and their actions are going to change depending on what you do. So the question is much more about what, as a community, do we do that is the ideal allocation. And so you can imagine that there's a list of high-impact things the community wants to get done. And then the question at that point is, where are you relatively best suited to take out of that portfolio of opportunities? And so in 80,000 Hours, we focus a lot on getting people to evaluate which career they have the best personal fit with. As I said in the talk, we look at how pressing the problem is, how effective the method is, and then your personal fit with the career, and that's our kind of standard framework. Also career capital, but I'll leave that for that. But now when we're a community, there's another thing besides personal fit, which is also your comparative advantage compared to other community members. The thing that's highest impact for you is the thing where you're relatively best suited to take that opportunity compared to other members of the community, and that you're coordinating with them. So we've been encouraging people to think through that in a bit more detail. But yeah, that's not then to say that it's just solely a matter of doing whatever you're most interested in or whatever you're most passionate about. We're not back to the kind of most common sense advice, which is basically follow your passion, everyone's different. But instead, it's more consider the portfolio of high impact opportunities and then choose from among those which one you're best relatively suited to. It's a combination of the two.
I apologise for introducing dilemmas, but what about this?
I'm not sure you really apologise at all there.
You do the figures and you work out that you can save 1 million lives by taking active, positive steps in relation to climate change. And I think that's not an unreasonable assumption, depending on your theory of climate change. But I want you to imagine that you operate in Australia, and if you start making noise about climate change, your charity will lose its tax-deductible status. What are you going to do? Helen might have it.
And that's a real dilemma. And certainly, it's ironic that in the last 5 years we've looked out at the world, the space for civil society is shrinking, and the rapid rate of shrinking is actually happening in Western developed countries at the moment, and Australia is the best of them. It's a dilemma that we face quite regularly, so I won't use that example because it's current, but there are times where, I'll give you a good example. Oxfam does campaign around climate change. There was a group of environmental organisations that were travelling to India to hand a letter to Mr Adani to talk about the impact of old fossil fuels and the investment in the Adani mine. Oxfam was invited to contribute to that letter, and we didn't because Oxfam India basically said if Oxfam's name is on that, Modi will shut us down. And so I think there's often dilemmas for international NGOs, for example, about whether they stay in a country. I'll think of a safe example. That was the case for Sri Lanka. Should Oxfam stay in that country and quietly work with civil society around human rights? Human rights organisations in Sri Lanka 4 years ago when I visited were saying, why don't you speak up more? We chose to do the quiet work rather than the public work because then we could stay in the country. Otherwise we would have got kicked out. So they are dilemmas that we constantly face, and there will be times where it will be untenable, and I suspect that's been the case for MSF.
Yeah, we've got a long history of doing that. You probably know many of the examples. Back to the mid-80s in Ethiopia when we were kicked out and we made a decision to publicly speak out about aid which wasn't reaching malnourished patients and people were dying despite the international support. and we decided after much discussion internally to say something about that, knowing the potential consequences, and we will keep going. Yeah, that's clear. And then we're not effective at all. Forget about altruism, you're not even in the country. We've got examples where we were kicked out of Darfur. We've got examples where we've said things and had extreme limitations placed on our access to patients. More recently in the Mediterranean, there's quite a refugee crisis there as well, as there is in many places around the world. It's an international crisis. We've set up search and rescue vessels, 3 of them, and a collaboration with another organisation to effectively fish people out of the water, escaping from Syria, Libya, from traditional migration routes through Africa to save lives, full stop. And again, there was a strong internal discussion about whether we should do it, and if we were going to do it, whether we should say something about it. We lost donors, that's clear. We also gained donors, and that's the balance. That's that sense of coming back to what Julian's mentioning about doing what you feel is right. And for MSF, we've got a strong sense of that. It doesn't mean it's perfect. It doesn't mean we've got these enshrined principles. The Red Cross is probably the best example of that, I would say, the International Committee of the Red Cross. We've got strong principles, but they can bend at times.
What would you say is the biggest opportunity that you turned down in this situation that you wish you'd taken up on, where the risks appeared bigger than they actually ended up might have been?
Internationally for MSF, we've got a lot of examples where we could have stayed in a place and made compromises. MSF doesn't like to make compromises generally. Somalia is a good example, but one of our most very raw, because we had some of our staff essentially taken hostage for a long period of time. We found out that the actors that we trusted are essentially were not to be trusted, and we left the country despite massive humanitarian needs. Now, did we see that the risks weren't as great as they were? I'm not sure. I've never worked there, but talking to people who had worked there, it was very complex. For us, I think it comes to a decision we try to make in a very binary way, but we can't because there's so many different factors. If we leave a country, we know that it will be hard to come back in. I worked in Pakistan after the earthquake almost 10 years ago. Natural disaster, essential, simple emergency response. 75,000 people died in this earthquake in the northwest of Pakistan and Kashmir area. We knew, though, that there were parts of Pakistan where we could also help, not emergency response, natural disaster, but look at remote areas where people didn't have access to primary health. There were security concerns, but there was also a quite active discussion with the government about what we could do in those places, and we didn't get the access that we could.
A few of you have mentioned the government a few times tonight. A lot of the tactics that we go into are in many cases treating the symptoms, and the underlying cause can be seen to be corrupt government in many situations here. And that responsibility on the government is, in some ways, could be seen as being taken away from them the more help that's being provided by the citizens, because they're then relying on the aid rather than asking the government to step up. How do you see that?
I don't think it's that simple, basically. I think that one of the things that we seem to be losing sight of globally is the importance of civil society in countries around the world holding governments to account, and in fact holding the private sector to account. So as globalisation increases, and particularly with the private sector, I think that there's an even more critical role for civil society to play. And one of the avenues to enhance the capacity of civil society in many of the countries around the world, one of the entry points might be through international aid. And so if you don't have the capacity to support civil society movements, then I think it's very difficult to get intelligence about what's going on the ground. It's very difficult to support the quiet development of movements. And if you think about, and these are long-term investments. I mean, the kind of popular cult of leadership like we're seeing in the Philippines can quickly turn the tone of a country, but to bring it back into shape is going to be, those things take much, much longer to do, and you need to build the networks, support the movements, resource the ability of people to come together. So I think it's not just a matter that aid creates dependence. I mean, I think aid is used in all sorts of odd ways by governments that fund it, but if it means that there is scrutiny in countries where which brings different forces into play that might make an investment in the longer term, then I think it's worth it. And that's certainly the case for organisations like ours. I mean, we have relationships, we don't have programs. We have a long-term investment in change, which is about people feeling empowered, not just about having the well or whatever else we do.
Okay, we have a question here for EA. How do you talk about EA without moral grandstanding and come across as sanctimonious? Would you like to answer that one, Bridget?
I actually think that effective altruism at its core is quite humble and is a movement that is trying to work out the best way to do good, and it's a movement that is altering its position on that or continually kind of, maybe not continually, but is receptive to change and receptive hopefully to other people's ideas about doing good. So in my experience in engaging with the effective altruism community, people do honestly want to hear what other people think about the best way to do good, because we do want to do good. So we want to challenge our own biases and assumptions and beliefs. So yeah, I think that sometimes people coming across the movement for the first time, it might seem a little bit conceited, but I think that really at its core it's a question of how can we do the most good, and we should be, and I think most people are really open to hearing different ideas on that.
Fantastic.
I'd be a bit more blunt. First of all, you do have to be, I agree with you completely, you have to be confident that on proper analysis what you are doing is worthwhile and is good according to any rational frame of reference, and if people think you're being sanctimonious because you're doing good, they can get fucked.
I don't really know how to follow that.
Well, Ben, what's your view on people and how they can make the most effort in this direction without getting sucked into many years of perhaps unpaid internships into this direction?
So doing unpaid internships is mainly just a problem in the non-profit sector. And on the 8,000 Hours Career Guide, we have 4 main parts we talk about: research, direct work, earning to give, and advocacy. And so there's lots of options you can take which don't involve doing unpaid internships. So that would be my quick answer to that. I guess just also going back to one of the earlier questions about should you focus on addressing root causes and trying to reform the government, or should you focus on directly helping people now? And this is again one of the common responses to effective altruism is just, but you're not addressing the root cause. And what I'd say about that is the way we address that is the question of what cause to work on or what problem to work on, which I think is a big theme of tomorrow morning at the conference. And so you could imagine a cause like trying to reform voting or trying to just distribute malaria nets in Africa, and those are 2 different causes. And then we have a framework for comparing those, which is importance or scale and neglectedness and solvability. And so the way effective altruists would analyse a question about which one you should do would be to try and compare side by side based on those three factors. There's going to be lots more about this tomorrow in the talk. And so for like the first one, you can imagine if you solve the issue, how good would it be? Secondly, how many people already were doing this? And then thirdly, how easy is it to push the change? And like roughly, the better it is, the better it does on all three of those factors.
And what about if you're inside an organisation or a large organisation? How would you then infiltrate that out within the corporation rather than just going and doing it on an individual level?
I mean, I think that really just depends a lot on the situation. That would come into assessing like the solvability of the problem that you're working on. There's a lot to say about then like tactics of how to be persuasive on a day-to-day level and so on. Just wrapping up my points, I think this stuff about like working with government in general is a big blind spot for effective altruists. And so, for instance, I think like reforming voting could be an interesting cause to look at. But you'd want to find something really neglected in that. So, like we recently found there's a couple of people working on alternative voting as a new way of doing voting. And if you can fix something like, if you improve something like how we choose our governments, that can affect lots of other issues. But this is an issue that hardly anyone's looking into in effective altruism, but it's really neglected and could be really big in scale. We're releasing a problem profile soon at 8,000 hours about improving collective decision making, which has this as one of the subcomponents.
So I'm going to tell a story, which is a kind of self-interested story because it's about one of my sons. He's a lawyer. I've got a number of lawyers actually.
Sounds so apologetic.
Very proud of him. And he chose to go to a particular law firm. He got offers from this, that and the other one, and he chose to go to a law firm for lifestyle reasons, he says. So it's one that wasn't going to flog him to death in the first, 5 years of his legal career. But he went there and he volunteered at the Refugee Immigration Law Centre as a law student. And the first year he went to the law firm and became a tax lawyer or something, dealing with things that don't seem to be very altruistic. Persuaded the law firm to establish a pro bono practice to work with the Refugee Immigration Law Centre to do migration law, which I understand is quite complex. And now and this law firm, which isn't one of the more progressive social law firms, has got about a $600,000 pro bono practice in this space, and they have now brought in other law firms to set up training modules so that they can, and barristers, and maybe even you've been involved in this, I'm not sure, to train lawyers up so they can help people who are refugees and who are asylum seekers. And I guess that's the thing about, you can cut the cloth. So he theoretically is on the kind of treadmill of, the big legal companies, and I imagine some of you are here, are in that. But it's possible to carve out where you have a big impact from the base of where you're at. And I guess I think that was in your talk, that, altruism isn't just about giving money, it's about actually contributing where you have particular skills and where you can have a good impact. And I could go on with some other examples.
Of doing it where you're at here, we have a question of what about some examples of effective altruism on the home front here, such as education and suicide in those areas? Stewart, you look like you're thinking of an answer there.
I'm thinking, but I'd be speaking out of my MSF world. We don't work in Australia, so I think there could be many examples, but I couldn't speak to them. I've worked in remote Indigenous communities in Central Australia. My worry would be that there's a sense of having to have a proof before you do something. Now, that's a little bit reductionist in what the movement is about. I know we're not talking about randomized controlled trials, but there is there is something about being there. Yeah, I can give you the MSF examples about being there, but in education, there's something about being in a remote Aboriginal community and trying to teach children in language and in English. Just by being there, you're actually showing that you are altruistic, and it doesn't necessarily need to be effective. There's so many people who are not there. And if the teachers of Australia could find a system where there's a rebalance of allocations, the doctors have had this discussed for decades, but if there's a way that we could maybe rebalance somehow so that the disproportionate access to education in Australia is rebalanced, I think it would be amazing. I think that would be something fascinating to look at for effective altruism.
Yeah, I guess just to elaborate on that as well, I guess it is important to be there, first of all, and to not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So something's good, and you can do that without it necessarily being the absolute, or you being completely confident that it's the perfect thing to do. But I think it is also, I guess, bringing an effective altruism mindset to these more local issues. You do also want to be there, but you also want to be thinking really critically about what you're doing there and analysing what you're doing and taking a scientific approach to your involvement in that cause.
I agree with both of what you've both said, but I think really the element that underpins what you've both said is the ethics of proximity. You may be able to do a lot of good in a third world country, but you get a great deal of satisfaction by helping someone who's right there, someone, and especially in remote Aboriginal communities, people whose circumstances are our fault. We caused it mostly. I was slightly critical of your acknowledgement of the traditional owners, by the way. I told my first buddy that I was at a thing recently and I had a chat to the person who was going to be chairing it, and I said, listen, this usual acknowledgement of the traditional owners is not only formulaic, it's also fake. And what you need to do is acknowledge that our ancestors took the land from them and we caused great harm by doing it. And then we took their children from them and caused even more harm. She did it. She made up something which acknowledged all those points, and the audience applauded. I think it's the only time I've ever heard an acknowledgement of country applauded. Anyway, I completely understand why you respond the way you said what you did about working in the remote Aboriginal communities. And oddly, I suspect that there's much more satisfaction for you in doing that than helping a similar number of people in another country somewhere else. Not only because of our causal role, but also because of the ethics of proximity. And I think the ethics of proximity is something that does deserve noticing, because I think, it may not fit the 80,000 hours analysis, but if it's real, then maybe it needs to be acknowledged and worked on.
And the only caution, and I suspect it's implicit in what you were saying, is that you work with those communities. And I think that, the issue of what we've done to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in Australia and what has happened in terms of the massive erosion and disregard in the last decade in particular is critical. So the only caution I would have is that there are plenty of people who want to go and work with remote communities, but there's an enormous sensitivity to being invited in, to understanding the rules of that engagement, to really understanding the compound effects of what has happened since colonisation of Australia. And we have a small Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander program that where those sensitivities play out with our staff who are in a white organisation. And you think about the Elijah Doherty outcome of that court case and the grief and compounding impact that has on those communities. So that's just the caution.
So what do you think are the least talked about, most urgent issues looking forward?
I mean, that's what my talk tomorrow is about, so...
Well, we can get their opinions on it now.
I cannot answer that. I just can't answer that. But I wanted to add something which is only marginally relevant. so as not to break the usual pattern. I think global warming or climate change is probably the greatest issue facing all of us, although it is talked about a lot. But there's an interesting irony in all of this. If global warming goes the way people think, and if it is anthropogenic and avoidable as most scientists think, but if it ends up where it seems to be heading, then most of us, probably all of us in this room, will perish. The great coastal capitals will perish. There'll be some survivors, Kalahari Bushmen, outback Aborigines, things like that, in which case Tony Abbott, by denying climate change, might actually arrange for the Aborigines to get their land back.
I feel like, Ben, this is kind of what you do, trying to work out what the most urgent and neglected issue is. But anyway, I guess from your organisation, I listened to an interesting podcast a couple of weeks ago with Toby Ord, and just talking about kind of what you were talking about just then, Julian, the threats to humanity and what might cause us to go extinct. And I think that Toby in that talk made a really good case for that being a particularly neglected issue, and some of the threats, not only climate change, but other things that might cause us to go extinct, such as asteroids or a really bad pandemic, that those are something that could have, really huge impacts. Like if humanity was to, or life on Earth, not just humanity, if life on Earth was to cease to exist, then that's pretty huge. So addressing some of those risks might be an area which isn't getting enough attention at the moment.
There's a lot of misinformation that is circulating about altruism and about the most good that you can do, and people thinking that things are a certain way that they're not. As our last question, rounding up for each person on the panel, the top fact you'd like people in the audience to repeat that's the most important to get out there right now?
One in 9 people go to bed hungry every night, and 80% of them are involved in production of food.
And every person in this room is privileged in a way that's almost unimaginable across the world and across most of human history.
That's a really hard question. Because I had a list of 6 other things I was going to answer your previous question on, and then I've got to bring it down to 1 now. And it's the kind of what keeps you up at night question, which I am more used to asking than answering. I think, so what's the one takeaway for me? We're probably now in a historical age where we're caring for other people less than we have ever done before. Communities have changed. The social interaction between one human being and another is radically different, even compared to what it was 15 years ago. And if we continue on the path, in my belief, not necessarily MSF's, but in my belief, we will become disengaged from each other as human beings, and that lack of humanity will be reflected in a number of different ways. In a lack of recognition for international humanitarian law, refugee definitions, even conventions, all of these kind of things. So if there's one thing that we can all do to prevent that happening is to do what we did at the start of tonight and talk to the person next to you, whether it's on a chair here in the auditorium or in the bus or on a plane or wherever it might be, just interact. For me, that's the biggie.
Yeah, I agree. Connecting with people and talking to people and finding out how you can work together, I think, is really important, and recognising and remembering that everybody has different life experiences and different backgrounds, which shape their perceptions of the world and also shape, the way that they interact with other people and the way that you can interact with them. And just, I think, being mindful of other people's backgrounds and how you can work together.
So I I probably disagree with that, and I think we're actually getting more altruistic over time, and that's another reason why I'm optimistic about effective altruism. And if you doubt that, then I would refer you to Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, which is a giant attempt to try to argue this with a lot of data. But I mean, I also think that in some ways our situation is like much more risky than it's ever been due to things like nuclear weapons. And so I think one big thing I would really want people to appreciate much more is the real importance of safeguarding what we have so that we can continue this progress where we're getting more altruistic, we're getting more technology, we're getting wealthier, and we're progressing in so many ways, and making sure we don't cut that short.
Fantastic. On that note, would you like to draw a name from that box sitting in front of you? And read it out.
Sharon, I think?
Charuz? Hey. Come on down. Everyone puts a name. Congratulations.
Maureen, no. Sorry.
So I've got Lisa. It's in capital letters, it's in a blue pen. It's mostly straight. The S is kind of hanging down a little bit. If that's you, Lisa.
Ben Robinson.
They're not here. Pick another again.
Pardon?
Lucky dip. Pick again.
Tim Salvador.
And lucky last, Eli with a mobile phone number.
Wonderful. Join me in a large round of applause and thanking our insightful panellists. Okay, and we're all hanging around for a chat apparently. If you'd like to come down and have any questions personally with the speakers.